Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. We are bringing you today another one in our Drilling Deep series from Adam Lowenstein, where Adam talks to authors of interesting new books on climate or politics or the combination thereof. Today, a conversation with Karen Elliott House, author of the new book, The Man Who Would Be King, Mohammed bin Salman and the Transformation of Saudi Arabia. Of course, Saudi Arabia, as Americans are being reminded these days, is not the only increasingly authoritarian nation reliant on oil extraction, determined to disrupt global climate negotiations, or obsessed with energy-ravenous AI. But as Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and former Wall Street Journal publisher House makes clear, it is a crucial one. House has been traveling to Saudi Arabia for more than 4 decades and has borne witness to both its power and its contradictions. She spent hours interviewing the Crown Prince and other Saudi officials for this book. But House also has, quote, a number of personal friends who have literally disappeared without any official explanation, she writes. In June, Adam Lowenstein spoke with House about how Saudi Arabia has changed under the Crown Prince, whether MBS's gamble on economic and social freedoms alongside civil and political repression is politically or environmentally sustainable, how Saudi Arabia's oil and petrochemical industries serve its geopolitical interests, and why the kingdom's promises about transitioning away from fossil fuels might be a bit less green than climate advocates would hope. That conversation is coming up after this quick break.
So I learned in the book, you've been going to Saudi Arabia for more than 4 decades. And I'm curious what originally piqued your interest about the kingdom.
The first time I went was in May of 1978. And Sadat had been to Jerusalem in November of 77. So the Middle East was a big issue. And the foreign editor of the Wall Street Journal told me, go see these places you're going to write about. So I went to Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia then was a more normal country than it was for most of that 40 years. When I arrived, I was taken to the oil minister's house for what I hoped was an interview. It turned out to be a dinner party. And so there were women all dressed and bejeweled and alcohol. And we watched the World Cup soccer final on, satellite TV. It was the kind of event that the religious police deplored. And shortly thereafter, after the attack on the Mecca Mosque, of course, that kind of thing disappeared in Saudi Arabia, and men and women were segregated, and all of the stuff that, that people know for most of the last 40 years until King Salman and his son took over and took the religious police off the street, let women drive, let women work, are trying to modernize and change the economy and the culture.
One of the things I've struggled to parse in terms of what's real and what is hype, what is marketing, is the scale of the transformation in Saudi Arabia over the last decade. And there's been a lot of talk about some of the efforts to allow women to drive, to increase the availability of entertainment, to scale back the presence of the religious police. But there's also kind of a relentless fire hose of promotion, in part from a lot of wealthy, self-interested Western investors who would like to do business with the kingdom. And so I had a hard time understanding what is real and what is not. But one of the main arguments of your book is that, at least in terms of social and economic freedom, this transition is real and legit and consequential. Can you talk about that a little bit, just how much the country has changed over, let's say, the last decade or so?
Yeah. I think as I try to, what interested me is where did Mohammed bin Salman, who's now 39 and was roughly 29 when he began changing the kingdom, where did he get these ideas? Because most Saudis, he grew up in the very conservative, heavy-handed religion, and that's apparently partly what motivates him to change, that he was a young kid who, the only thing he could do was play video games because there was no other entertainment, which is true. There was nothing really except kids could kick a soccer ball around in a field of garbage here and there in town. He is motivated. He understands that they can't live off of oil revenue forever, and that people have to be motivated and educated to work. So he is determined to bring more resources into the world of work, and women are a major educated resource, and they're much more motivated than most men because they haven't had the opportunity to do anything other really than to teach school. There are a few doctors here and there, but most the only career that was sanctioned for women really was breeding children or teaching children. And he is not, he has obviously set back political freedom. Um, in the days when I went there under King Fahd, under King Abdullah, uh, you weren't ever supposed to criticize the king, but in the newspapers, you could read the health ministry failed at this, the defense ministry failed at that. I mean, mild criticism, and you didn't wind up in prison. And I think, he feels that I'm doing these things fast. I don't have time to have everybody telling me how to do it and getting in the way. So, and I think, he thinks he knows what to do. His whole philosophy is that what's wrong with the world is incremental thinking. You have to have out of the box thinking. And that's something, if you noticed in the last chapter of the book, Lee Kuan Yew also had that. The Singaporean prime minister had that view that I'm in charge here. I know I've got to drive you hard to get you where you ought to be. But the changes are truly significant. This country is still conservative. So you still see most women wearing abayas, but you don't have to. The last time I saw the Crown Prince, he said to me, I was still wearing my black abaya when I walked into his office, and he said, you don't have to wear that. And I said, I know, and sat down and started asking questions. But I think back to your point about how much marketing hype there is, the Crown Prince himself is a marketer. That was my impression of him in our first meeting. He is, and I don't mean in a kind of cheap, hypey way, but he is self-confident, and he is charismatic, and he is out to convince you that here's the way things are going to be, and here's what I'm doing to get them there. I mean, he likes to sell, and he's quite effective at it, I think. Plus, they have all this money, and they hire everybody in the world to tout what's going on in the kingdom, like Lionel Messi, the soccer player. They tried to hire him for their soccer club. He didn't, he said no, but they pay him $25,000 a year to promote their attempts to get the World Cup, which they did, and to promote the country's tourism business.
One of the things I found most remarkable in the book was the fact that most Saudis had not even heard of MBS as recently as, I think, 2015. And a decade later, you describe him as having pretty much total control over the government, over the country. He chairs the Public Investment Fund. He's chairing Saudi Aramco. Can you talk about how he has managed to? There's obviously lots of internal machinations in internal politics, which you describe in detail in the book. But from a, I guess, maintaining the consent of the governed perspective, how's he maintained that kind of absolute power over so many aspects of the country in such a short time?
I think essentially in at least two ways. One, most of the 60% of the country is under 30 years of age. So they want change, most of them, not all of them. Some of them are conservative, but most want change. So he has offered them entertainment and jobs. And for those who are less enamored, he's offered strong political suppression. Well, he, as you know, put the most of the senior royals in the Ritz-Carlton, along with prominent business people, forced them to pay what he said was ill-gotten gain, and it probably was. The country was a very corrupt country. Under Abdullah, most people said that up to 30% of the budget was just taken, on this and that project. So he tried to intimidate the royals, remove the religious police from the streets, and the religious scholars who didn't agree. Some of them found themselves also in prison. And then the old Saudi way of buying people to keep people happy. The religious police are still paid. They're just not allowed to go out on the street and arrest anyone. So with a combination of intimidation and entertainment for the young, and his father obviously agrees with these things, or at the beginning. I don't know how active or alert his father is now, but when he first became king, he obviously supported MBS, and that was a big part of his ability to consolidate control. And his father got rid of the first crown prince and put in a second one, and then got rid of that crown prince and put in his son, Mohammed. So his father has been instrumental in helping him consolidate power, but he has the reputation of willingness to use whatever means is necessary to get and retain control so that he can reform and transform the country in the way he believes it ought to go. But he
Mm-hmm.
is the emphasis.
Yeah, you mentioned Lee Kuan Yew, the former strongman leader of Singapore, and you compare MBS to him a few times in the book. It's interesting because Lee Kuan Yew, beloved by, in particular, Western executives and investors and business leaders who prize above all else the freedom, the free flow of financial capital, and stability. One way to preserve stability within a society is through autocracy and not permitting any democratic processes, any political process, stifling, all kind of political activity and criticism and dissent. And you point out throughout the book that even as these social and economic freedoms have genuinely increased within Saudi Arabia, the political climate has gotten even more repressive. Mm-hmm. In your travels there, because this is something I've written about, lots of Western journalists have reported on this, lots of human rights groups doing really important work in terms of covering political repression within Saudi Arabia. What is the political climate within the country itself among the people of Saudi Arabia?
Fundamentally, there's no history in Saudi Arabia of people having any control of their lives. I mean, mostly these were Bedouin tribes, and the chief was in charge. And and the social contract was keep me from starving, and I give you my loyalty. And that's been the social contract with the Al Saud for the 300 roughly years that they've been in charge of Saudi Arabia. So people they want government where they can count on a decent life. They don't want an enormous amount of corruption. I mean, when I wrote my first book, Saudis were so upset with the royal family taking so much of everything that people used to steal the sheets off their hospital bed on the theory that if the royals can steal, so can I. Just frustration at the fact that they they felt it was an unfair system. They don't purport to know how to lead or want to vote on somebody. They just want government that's transparent and accountable. So I think he has tried to provide more of that, the transparency, having key performance indicators for all the ministers and tracking them and publishing. Here's what we're trying to do. Here's what we've done. Here's what we haven't done. I mean, he's not afraid of the report card, but he is the superintendent, the principal, and the star pupil. Mr. Everything, people call him, because he did kind of come from nowhere. I mean, he was the sixth son of his father, so he shouldn't have amounted to anything in a hierarchical society. And Saudis were kind of, where did he come from? Because he had government jobs, but they weren't prominent ones. So people didn't know much about him. And then suddenly he's reshaping the government, and he's the deputy crown prince, and then he's the crown prince, and then he's in charge, as you said, of the public investment fund, Aramco, everything in the country, every entity, in essence, reports to him.
You mentioned KPIs. I get the impression that MBS personally is quite interested in the prestige and the reputation of firms like McKinsey, who played a big role in Vision 2030, and lots of other Western consulting firms. I've written a lot about some of the Western PR firms and public affairs and lobbying shops that have secured some quite lucrative contracts with the PIF and Aramco and other parts of the Saudi government. You make a few references throughout the book to the role of foreign consultants in the country. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how and why, I guess, these Western firms are so involved in the government of Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman.
As you've already said, the Western firms all see Saudi Arabia as a place they can make money, that he's trying to modernize. So, I'll get in there. I've got ideas. And he is happy to hire. I mean, his whole philosophy, as I say in the book, is it's better to attempt 100 things and succeed at 50 than attempt 5 and succeed at 4. That trying to change everything is a good idea. And so because of that, he has a reason to hire umpteen advisors, consulting firms to advise on this, that, and the other. I mean, the line, the big city that they're building or planning to build.
Right. Important distinction.
It's not there yet. They hired, I guess, 5 different architectural firms, not one. And then they kind of put them all together, and you let the architects debate each other, and then Mohammed debates with them, and then that's the end of the debate. I mean, he decides, as somebody used to say, or said to me, we used to debate and never decide. Now we decide and never debate, which is a kind of interesting, succinct summary. But all those firms are there to make money, and because he's trying to do literally Mao's let a thousand flowers bloom, he's trying to let a thousand projects bloom. So, they're all rushing in to get a piece of the money. I'm sure that, much of what they do is overcharge and underperform. But I mean, the only one of these I've ever read was the McKinsey Vision 2030 document. So, and I guess a lot of that, the things proposed are really in the many 5-year plans that the country had from 1970 on, but they produced a plan every 5 years and put it on the shelf. Very little of it ever got done. So probably McKinsey went back and read all the 5-year plans. I don't know, but that would be a good place to start, just to know what's been proposed before. I don't know that they did or didn't, but I know that the 5-year plans mostly were put on the shelf and not executed.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book the succession of 5-year plans for transitioning the kingdom away from relying so much on oil, and how those 5-year plans, like you said, have been published time and time again, and nothing has fundamentally changed. I think a lot of people obviously we hear about the climate crisis, we hear about Aramco in Saudi Arabia playing a role in global climate negotiations as kind of a baseline for where we are right now. Can you talk about where, here in 2025, where the kingdom is at in its reliance on oil and the scale at this point of that reliance, and I guess where they are in the transition that has been talked about, as you mentioned, for many iterations of 5-year plans, and is obviously a big part of Vision 2030 and what you hear from MBS and other government officials today?
Well, obviously, oil is still the major source of revenue. It used to be about 70, 80% of the budget revenue, 40% of the GDP of the country. The goal is to get non-oil to 65% of GDP. But right now, it's only they haven't made that much progress yet. But they are, and I believe sincerely, they are trying to develop renewable energy, because the Saudis are the most profligate energy users in the world. They use like 3.7 million barrels a day for 20 million, 30 million people. And they use much more than anybody except China and the US, who have vastly, vastly greater populations. So they want to have renewable energy so that they can keep some of the fossil fuels to sell to the world, because their oil is the cheapest in the world to produce. So I think it's roughly $3 a barrel is my recollection. So when it's selling at 80, I mean, that's huge profit. So they don't want to run out of the ability to have oil to sell. Secondly, they're in a climate that is incredibly hot. So they already have, according to a RAND study, and one by their own King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, they have 95 days a year that the temperature is above 100. So it's hard to develop tourism when you have such excessively hot days, and tourism is one of the industries they're trying to grow. And according to RAND, there are going to be 180 days over 95 degrees by 2030. So they do need to do what they can to try to keep down. Nothing they're doing is going to meet the Paris Accords. Don't have more than 1.5 degrees Celsius rise. I mean, China's running that, various others, but they do have an incentive, I think, to produce as much renewable energy as they can, both to reduce the greenhouse gases they produce and to have oil that is replaced by sun and wind so they can sell it for more money. So they're producing, as I said in the book, they're putting a chit on every possible option for energy production, green energy, solar, wind, and the two are not mutually incompatible. I mean, the state of Texas is one of the few places that has managed to reduce the role of oil in its GDP. So it is still America's largest energy producer and also America's largest, the state, producer of renewable energy. And I think that's exactly, what MBS's goal is we want to be a big producer of renewable energy, and we need it, we use it, and we can try to sell it. And we also want to be a major producer of oil and gas because the world is going to need it far beyond 20, 30, 40, 50, so that they have more time, they believe, to get the economy off oil. But they need to ideally keep the country from being seen as too hot to visit.
At one point in the book, you describe them as trying to be or striving to be the last oil producer standing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, is it a fair assertion to say that they're trying to do two things simultaneously? One is reduce their own reliance on oil, while at the same time doing what they can to preserve global demand for oil as long as possible.
Yeah, I would say that's fair. They want to reduce their own demand for oil so they can, yes, have it to sell to the world. As you recall in the book, Prince Abdulaziz, the energy minister, says we have to not write off the third world. We can't be so pure and holy about our air and climate change that we, in essence, say the rest of the 700 million people who still burn sticks for heat, that's the only heat they can have. They're not going to be able to have oil because they deserve a chance to develop, and burning oil is less abusive, he says, to the atmosphere than, burning wood. I'm not an expert on that, but, he's very big on the idea that you can't tell most of the world they have to stop their development right where they are because we elite Western nations don't want any more greenhouse gases released. So, I mean, it's a point that Dan Yergin makes too, the energy guru.
One thing that you talk about in the book is some of the consequences geopolitically, but also for the purposes of this conversation from an energy and climate perspective of Saudi Arabia's growing relationship with China, particularly in petrochemicals. And you write at one point that Aramco believes the market for turning oil into chemicals will last beyond the uses of oil for gasoline. I think the oil for gasoline is what we often think of as the source of the climate crisis, at least from a day-to-day individual perspective. But what does it mean for this growing investment in petrochemicals, and particularly between two countries, Saudi Arabia and China, that are, huge users and consumers of energy?
Saudi Arabia, I think, is determined. They have a distrust of the United States from at least the Obama administration forward, but even with George W., they told him not to go into Iraq, and he did. So they're nervous. And Mohammed bin Salman wants to be a big man on the world stage, so he has to deal with Russia to control global energy prices. He deals with China because China is the biggest buyer of oil and Saudi oil, as well as Iranian oil that they're buying at cut rate prices. So I think, he wants a relationship with China. So investing in China and having China invest in Saudi is something that I think he sees as a good geopolitical investment. I don't know if it's a good energy investment. I mean, it's kind of beyond my pay grade to argue on that. But I mean, the Chinese are doing all kinds of work in Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis seem to just be investing money in petrochemical plants there. I don't think the Saudis actually need China for petrochemicals. They've got their own. So personally, I think it's more of a political investment than an energy investment. And
Gotcha.
the Crown Prince, as you may know, has mandated teaching Chinese in addition to English in Saudi schools. And I'm told that his own children study Chinese. So, he's got something invested in that. I think the Chinese and the Saudis have a compatibility because the Chinese president is an autocrat, and he sees himself as the head of a great civilization. MBS sees himself as the head of a great civilization, Islam. They both feel that the U.S. is trying to tell them all the time that human rights are universal, and they don't buy it. And they also believe that the repression of your people politically is the right thing to do to hold the society together, to have unity. So, I mean, I think they have a lot of compatibility that you wouldn't normally think of between a young man and an old man, and a religious or Islamic government and an atheistic government. But I think they're quite compatible in their outlook on individualism is bad. It's the health of the group, the unity that should be paramount.
I wanted to ask you about Jamal Khashoggi because you knew him pretty well, right? Or at least you'd met with him a number of times over the years. I'm just wondering, just from a kind of an individual perspective, you also mentioned in the book that you've gotten to know a number of other Saudis who've been imprisoned, some of whom are still imprisoned for criticism or alleged criticism of the government, or I think you describe it as threatening national security being one of the kind of catch-all allegations against critics. So yeah, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with Jamal Khashoggi. And
under King Abdullah, he was a journalist in various newspapers and interviewed Osama bin Laden. But King Abdullah's government seemed to use him to, for foreigners like me to talk to, if you want to talk about society in Saudi Arabia. So, I had dinner with him in Jeddah a couple of times, once with his wife, and, saw him in Riyadh also, and saw he worked for Prince Al Walid bin Talal, the rich Saudi prince that is investor in a lot of American companies. And they were trying to start a new TV channel in the Middle East, which began right after King Salman came to power, and it was shut down immediately. But anyway, the last time I saw him, we had lunch in the Hosama Hotel in Riyadh, which has since been torn down. But he never said anything in my recollection of the 20 years I knew him. He didn't criticize the royal family, but he was confident enough to explain things in a not a tentative way, a confident way. He did not criticize the crown prince in that last lunch. He expressed his unhappiness that he was not being allowed to write anymore. And he said, I would prefer to have democracy, but at least we have KPIs, key performance indicators for accountability, that he would prefer the ballot for accountability, but at least there was some accountability. I mean, he had a good sense of humor, as illustrated by that. And then he left not too long thereafter to come to the United States and became a columnist. And I never saw him again when he was in the US. I mean, I would see him on TV from time to time. But so, yeah, it was for me a big shock when you see him after the death walking into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, on the film, and not walking out. I mean, it still seems to me such a stupid thing. But our view, I've never had power like Mohammed bin Salman, so who knows how I would use it, but I don't believe I would have done that. And as I said in the book, the only genuine human rights activist I ever knew was Mohammed Khatani, who worked for the government, and he was determined to change Saudi Arabia through its own law. So he wasn't somebody calling for protests, etc. He planned to do it legally, but he asked the king to remove his half brother, the interior minister, and that was considered criticism near treason, and he was put in prison for 10 years. And then when he was supposed to get out, he, quote, disappeared. But I was told that was in the fall of 2023. I was told in March of this year when I was there that he is now out and is at his apartment in Riyadh, not saying anything. So I believe that is probably true, but I have not been able to personally test it. And the other one was my translator for the first book. We worked together for 5 years, nearly 6 years. He was also working for the government, and I do have no idea what happened to him. Nobody professes to know. I have been unable. We kept in touch with each other, and then in the fall of 2021, when I tried to reach him on WhatsApp, I never got an answer, and I never got an answer since. And this year, when I tried again, as I do routinely on that number, a man answered me and said, I am not Abdullah Shamri. This is my number. I've had it for 6 months. So I don't know what happened to Abdullah, and I still hope to learn, because he was definitely not a political activist. So I have no idea. And he had a family and children, and he was a religious man, and understood the system well. So I can't believe he did anything that would have gotten him in trouble, because I never heard him in 10 years of dealing with him say anything critical about any of the royal family. So, but that part is sad to see people disappear.
Yeah, I was struck in the book by the extent to which MBS seems to be really focused on how he and the kingdom more broadly, but he in particular is perceived. And I wondered if you thought that there was a that might explain some of the willingness to, you know, to lock up people who, like a Twitter user who has 9 followers. You know, these
Mhm.
people who clearly pose no threat to the regime or to MBS. But this combination of spending so much money on consultants and PR gurus to create a certain image of the kingdom internally, but also externally to investors and companies and potentially tourists, and also policing the speech so aggressively, particularly online, which is where perceptions are often created these days. And I'm just wondering if you see a link between those two and this almost obsessive focus on how the kingdom is perceived.
Yeah, I think he clearly does have a obsession with how he and the kingdom are perceived, because I think it's like the old French line, what is it? État c'est moi. The state, he is the state, and so it is important that he be positively perceived, because that's in essence the only way the state can be positively perceived in his mind. And I think it's true, I mean, that you can't separate in a monarchy like that. We have a great king, but the state stinks, or vice versa. That the king stinks and the state is great. So I think, yeah, that he has spent a lot of money on consultants, et cetera. But my view is that he believes himself to be more the vision, the need to project the country. He doesn't do a lot of public speaking. I think he does see people, more the one-on-one influence, the opposite of Donald Trump. He is not out talking all the time, posting all the time, preening all the time. He is more private in that sense. Some of the people who work for him say he is shy. I I don't see that, but I mean, he doesn't seem to like public speaking a lot. He doesn't show up at the UN and give speeches like Netanyahu or, Trump or other people. So I think he was obviously bothered by the way the world treated him right after the Khashoggi event. And I still have this picture of not only the high five with Putin, but he stood there at the G20 with his bisht wrapped around him and his arms folded, and the other heads of state walked by him without saying anything, but he stood there. Um, and it's his view, I think, also is the best defense is a good offense. Don't disappear, hold your hold your ground, and it will eventually get better. And I think it has. That he, when Joe Biden came to Saudi to ask for more oil, he just said no, given the way Biden had treated him. Um, so he has a strong, I think he has a strong sense of confidence about what he's trying to do, and so he doesn't wilt and melt when he comes under fire. I mean, I think any politician or monarch has to have a pretty strong sense of self-confidence to hold up.
The idea that anyone could run a country requires a certain level of ego that most people, probably for good reason,
Don't have.
don't have.
Right.
You spent quite a bit of time with him for this book, and you've interviewed him a number of times, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think you will be invited to speak with him again after this book comes out?
I have no idea. I mean, it was not written to savage him, and it was not written to save him. Um, I tried to be very analytical because I think that he is so much better for the country than another old man. That he's not the perfect leader, but none of us have the perfect leader. So if I had a vote between him and his uncle Mugrin that his father fired, or even Mohammed bin Nayef, his cousin, he's got much more dynamism and drive and determination and courage than most Saudis do. And I think the country needs a real kick forward. I said in my first book that the risk to the kingdom was it would go the way of the old Soviet Union, with one old man after another, Brezhnev, Chernenko, and Andropov. And by the time they got to the next generation, Gorbachev, it was too late. Or maybe Gorbachev just wasn't smart enough. I don't know. But, in that the risk in Saudi Arabia was the same. Abdullah, Sultan, Nayef, Salman, and, that the country was sclerotic and needed the arteries cleaned out. And I said they still have time and they have a lot of money for surgery and stents. But is there a daring doctor who could perform the operation? And I think MBS is as close to the daring doctor as I've seen. I met Mohammed bin Nayef for the first book when he was running the rehabilitation of terrorists, Saudi terrorists. I don't know anybody that's got the confidence and drive. I've never met another Saudi with the confidence and drive other than a man who's in prison now, Salman Aouda, um, who was one of the awakening sheikhs in the mid 90s and was put in prison by King Fahd, then let out, and under Abdullah became quite had a weekly TV show and magazines and, was a media mogul almost. And I don't know what he did, but he is in prison. He believes, from what his son says, that he's there because he is accused of criticizing the government, the crown prince, for severing relations with Qatar. But anyway, he is a truly charismatic, confident man. Uh, Impressive, I always thought. And I unabashedly say I think MBS, while coming with a lot of baggage, comes with this drive and determination to move the country forward, and it needs that very much. And I know a lot of Saudis don't agree. I got an email from, I don't know who he is, but just saying to me, I don't want my wife working with strange men. This is not what we want. And I know there are people there that think that, because I lived with a very religiously conservative lady when I was doing the first book. So, and I'm from a very religiously conservative family. So I have never felt, intimidated in Saudi Arabia by the fact that, there are people who believe deeply and believe that you shouldn't be focused on the things of the world. My father didn't let us wear shorts or pants, or we had no TV, no telephone, we could not date, all the He was a good Saudi father.
Do you think that that experience growing up drove you, consciously or not, to be interested in Saudi Arabia all those years ago?
It probably did, because I was just truly fascinated by the country. And that first time I went, I met some professional women. So people like that existed in limited numbers. But, I also heard, from people what religion was like. And then in subsequent visits, after it became even more important, and I got uh, stopped on the streets of Jeddah for wearing a dress that came below my calves. But the religious police guy said in perfect English, "What is this? What is this?" pointing at my ankles, and told the man I was with, a businessman, get her in the car. But I didn't, somehow, I don't know, the religious excess didn't turn me off on the country, because I had grown up in a town where the only thing there was to do, town of 900 people with 5 churches, was go to church. We did have a drive-in theater, but we weren't very often able to go to it unless my father took us to see the 10 Commandments or something like that. But, so it didn't frighten me. It intrigued me.
It was not unfamiliar, it sounds like.
Yeah, it was familiar.
Thanks so much for this conversation, Karen. I appreciate it.
Thank you.